Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube. If you've not already done so, please silence your phones. Tomorrow, September 22nd at 4:30 p.m., New York Times bestseller Ron Rash will speak outdoors in the garden of the Welty House for the 2022 Betty Jolly Lecture. This free event is sponsored by the Eudora Welty Foundation, and a reception in the Visitor Center will follow Rash's talk. We have not been able to have the Jolly Lecture for the last couple of years due to the pandemic, and I am excited about Ron Rash. I hope we'll see you there. And then I hope that you'll join us next week for History's Lunch when Sakina Butts, Maggie Crawford, and Rolando Hertz will screen the documentary Voices from the Delta State Sit-In. It's a story that too many of us here in central Mississippi don't know about, but in 1969, 52 students at Delta State College at the time formed a black student organization and eventually had a sit-in at the president's building. And the university began to commemorate that event about a decade ago, and then students began working on this documentary film. It's a really great story, and looking forward to having them here next week. Today, we're delighted to welcome Aram Goudsouzian and Vijay Shah to talk about the new graphic novel they've collaborated on titled Man on a Mission, James Meredith and the Battle of Ole Miss. And we are delighted to be joined by Mr. Meredith himself. Aram Goudsouzian is the Bizot Family Professor of History and Director of the Marcus W. Orr Center for the Humanities at the University of Memphis. He earned his BA in History from Colby College, his MA in History from the University of Massachusetts, and his PhD in History from Purdue. Goudsouzian is the author of 5 books, including Down to the Crossroads, Civil Rights, Black Power, and the Meredith March Against Fear, and is co-editor with Charles W. McKinney, Jr. of An Unseen Light, Black Struggles for Freedom in Memphis, Tennessee. Independent scholar Vijay Shah was acquisitions editor for the University Press of Mississippi from 2013 to 2019. Shah earned his BA in History from Reed College and his MA in Social Sciences from the University of Chicago. Vijay was the editor that really had the idea and pulled this together. He is in Ohio, so we'll hear first from him via Zoom, and then Aram here on stage. Help me welcome Vijay Shah.
Thanks, Chris. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great, because I got clicked out for a minute there. Good afternoon, good people. I'm very glad to address the capital city. Actually, I used to live in Jackson while working at a publisher in Eastover. I even attended History is Lunch at the previous room when we were kind of all crammed in there, and at the spacious new venue. So I may know some of you. Hello, Rims and Judy. It was when I was leaving town and moving back home to Ohio that I thought of the concept for a historical comic about James Meredith. By then, there were a number of successes in that graphic genre. So I asked myself what Mississippi stories would lend themselves to that format, something with a positive ending. At the same time, I was running into Mr. Meredith around town at the public library, Broad Street and such. Everything was converging, kind of like that old Reese's commercial. Remember two great tastes that taste great together, peanut butter and chocolate? At that point, I brought the dream team together, minus Charles Barkley, the round mound of rebound. Aram had written an acclaimed book on the Meredith March Against Fear. And our illustrator, Bill Murray, not the comedian on Saturday Night Live, our Bill, had earlier sent me some samples in the mail. Bill had graduated from the Art Institute of Chicago, and a lot of experience in and out of the Black press, Reader's Digest, Ebony, USA Today, Jet. He illustrated comic strips, Those Browns and Sonny Boy. He even founded his own comics company. What an impressive career. The last thing I needed to do was get the go-ahead from Mr. Meredith himself. I can't do impressions, but I expected something like, a response something like, "You want me to be in a comic book?" But I thought he was gonna laugh me out of the building. But to his credit, he actually said the idea was better than good. I'll never forget that. Thanks to our publisher, University of Arkansas Press, the end result is a vivid historical comic that dramatically depicts Mr. Meredith's relentless pursuit of justice at Ole Miss and beyond. We take you to Oxford, of course, but continue after graduation into the 70s and 80s, all told from Mr. Meredith's distinct voice. I believe that our book is such a wonderful blend of historical research and creative inspiration. Among my favorite qualities is that our book puts you right in the thick of the action when Mr. Meredith is heading to Oxford, on the way to the site of confrontation. Actually, our book begins on September 20th, 1962, 60 years ago yesterday. 60 years ago since Mr. Meredith attempted to register. 60 years ago since the mob of 2000 attacked. 60 years ago since President Kennedy called in federal troops. 60 years ago since James H. Meredith famously enrolled, integrating Ole Miss. With that, as they say on the 6 o'clock news, over to you, Aram.
Am I good now? Oh, there we go. Yeah. Let me start again then. Good afternoon. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here as part of the History is Lunch program. Thank you to Chris Goodwin and to everyone here at the two Mississippi Museums for hosting us. I very much appreciate my team of Vijay and Bill. We worked together on this project. It was really a COVID project for the most part. So we've sent approximately 6,000 emails to each other over this time. We've collaborated, rejoiced, got angry at each other. We did it all together. But the end product is worth it. You know, I was just sitting here with Mr. Meredith, and he was just saying, of all the books with my name on it, I think this will be the one that has the biggest impact. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I do, but we are very appreciative of having Mr. Meredith's support for this project, as Vijay was saying, right from the beginning. And he stuck with us all the way. So we very much, once again, are thankful for that. All right, in my remarks today, I'm not going to talk so much about the comic book itself, so much as about Mr. Meredith and about his role in American history. We'll have time at the end where you can ask questions of Vijay, of me, or of Mr. Meredith. But let's begin, as Vijay was suggesting, 60 years ago, on September 30th of 1962, when James Meredith arrived in Oxford, Mississippi to register, finally, at the University of Mississippi. Of course, the first black student to attend the university after a prolonged legal challenge. Oxford at this point was like a war zone. Rows of military planes, hundreds of U.S. marshals, the campus, bathed in floodlights. Meredith needed a military escort to get to his dormitory, Baxter Hall, and he was just under constant watch. At the other end of the campus, a mob had gathered, roughly 2,000 to 3,000 people, chanting things like 2413, we hate Kennedy, saying things like we want Meredith, and get a rope. Federal marshals were in the Lyceum building, the Central Administration building, at the very center of the campus, and they were under siege. The mob was screaming insults, brandishing shotguns, tossing bottles, tossing bricks, making Molotov cocktails, and hoisting a Confederate flag atop the pole in the Lyceum Circle. That mob included students, it included local people, it included extreme white ringers from way beyond Mississippi as well. The governor of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, was stoking this violence. Ole Miss, as it was known, was his historic bastion of white power, of white privilege. And in the minds of segregationists, the federal presence there was a form of tyranny. Barnett had promised to the president, John F. Kennedy, and the Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, that there would be order on campus. But instead, in the moment, he was decrying the, quote, oppressive power of the federal government. And in fact, he withdrew the Mississippi Highway Patrol from the scene, which basically left the U.S. Marshals to their own devices and really stoked the chaos of that day. John F. Kennedy had to order 5,000 U.S. Army troops onto the scene, but they couldn't arrive until 2 a.m. because they were arriving from Memphis. Kennedy had also broadcast on television calling for peace. And it's really important to recognize at this point that the way that the Ole Miss crisis was really reshaping the Kennedys' position on civil rights, where they'd been sort of reluctant to intervene in the past. Now he was seeing not just resistance to black demonstrators, but to the authority of the federal government itself. He said, Americans are free, in short, to disagree with the law, but not to disobey it. If this country should ever reach the point where any man or group of men by force or threat of force could long defy the commands of our court and our Constitution, then no law would stand free from doubt. No judge would be sure of his writ, and no citizen would be safe from his neighbors. With the only 500 marshals there because of Barnett's promises that there be orders, and also the U.S. Marshals' pledge that they would not use rifles, they were instead relying on tear gas and clubs. 160 marshals were wounded in this violence, 28 by gunfire, others by makeshift missiles, gas inhalation. 2 innocent bystanders in this chaos were dead. One was a local jukebox repairman who was just observing the scene and was hit by a stray bullet. The other was a French reporter who was killed under somewhat mysterious circumstances. When James Meredith woke up the next morning and peered out his window at Baxter Hall, he saw a campus that looked like a war zone. You could still smell the tear gas in the air. Meredith was not pleased, of course, obviously, at this violence, but he also recognized something, that he had initiated what he called, quote, a supreme test of the Union. Out of this, James Meredith emerged as something of a national icon. Reporters from Time, Newsweek, the New York Times were profiling him as a patriotic, resolute man. They admired his soberness, his close-cropped hair, his pencil-thin mustache, clad in a neat suit, toting a briefcase. He was a man who braved the insults of hostile students, who sort of rose above all these questions about his academic performance, who persevered through an isolating experience. The African-American press in particular marveled at his quiet courage. Here was a man who was upending the racial order of Mississippi, and at the same time very much, in some ways, conveying a traditional value system of education, of self-discipline, of respectability. So on one hand, these descriptions really pinpoint some of the historical importance of James Meredith. With his singular will and with his courage, He propelled a crisis that ultimately attacked the foundation of Jim Crow. On the other hand, James Meredith is a much more complicated figure than that. He doesn't fit neatly into the box of a civil rights icon. He's an iconoclast. He's resistant to any particular label. In some ways, he's a radical, a man who seeks to destroy the entire mantle of white supremacy. And he's been doing so from the era of Jim Crow into the era of Black Lives Matter. In other ways, he's a conservative. He's a man who very much adheres to traditional ideas about manhood, about Cold War militarism, about independence. He is a civil rights icon, but he's also a critic of some of its core values, such as nonviolence. That said, he has no connection really to the Black Power movement, which was also a critic of that structure. And he's a mystic, an eccentric, sometimes prone to outlandishly ambitious statements, even at the same time that he embodies self-reliance. In other words, he's a paradox. To understand James Meredith, you have to, in many ways, take him on his own terms, to wrestle with his contradictions, to see him as human, to avoid applying him just to our own political uses. To study James Meredith is to get a more nuanced understanding of the entire Black freedom struggle and American history. His background shapes his principles. He was born in 1933 in Kosciuszko, Mississippi, in the rural Hill County. He's the oldest child of Cap and Roxy Meredith. His father, Cap, owned an 84-acre farm. He was long a registered voter, which of course was rarity in rural Mississippi for an African-American man. As James Meredith would reflect, my father was the first member of his family ever to own a piece of land. In his house, I learned the true meaning of life. Here, I learned that death was to be preferred to indignity. So his father was his model of manhood, so to speak, and it led to this development of Meredith's notion that land was in particular a key means to independence, but also it helped to adhere him to the ideals of dignity and frugality and education. It's kind of a vision of conservative self-reliance. At the same time, Meredith, as he grew up, started to harbor a belief in his own special destiny. He recalled his father telling him, quote, "We are the chosen family. It is your duty and responsibility to lead our people to their place in the world." In his memoir that he wrote in the 1960s called 3 Years in Mississippi, he often referred to this as his, quote, divine responsibility, that he had a God-ordained mission to destroy Mississippi's racial system. For most of the 1950s, Meredith spent in the Air Force. He was stationed at bases around the country. He earned very good evaluations. He got promoted to sergeant. Military life, in a lot of ways, reinforced his values of discipline, order, and strength. But he also saw racial hypocrisies within this national institution at the same time. As one story that he tells is of a white soldier who told him that he liked him, but he couldn't abide by the orders of a black man. And he did not use the term black man, he used a racial slur. In these same years, he married his first wife, June. He took college courses at various campuses while he was stationed in the Air Force, and he saved money and bought land with it. In 1957, the Air Force transferred him to Japan, to Tachigawa Air Force Base, outside of Tokyo. And on one hand, this was a very liberating experience for him. He was free of sort of the constant patterns of racial prejudice that he faced in the United States. But on the other hand, the Civil Rights Revolution was brewing at home, and Meredith yearned to be a part of it, with the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, and the Montgomery bus boycott, and the Little Rock crisis. So there was a racial crisis brewing at home, and Meredith yearned to play his role. He was honorably discharged from the Air Force in 1960, and he returned to the state of Mississippi after essentially a decade away. He enrolled at Jackson State University. At this point, he had accumulated a number of credits, so he was getting close to graduation. And at this time, it's clear that he believed that he could play a role in the dismantling of white supremacy. In the James H. Meredith papers at the University of Mississippi, you can find a copy of an essay that he wrote for a philosophy course. And the essay is entitled, "What I Believe." And in it, he wrote, "I believe that the Negro as a group can, through the proper use of his energy, move from a position of inferiority to a position of superiority." At the same time, he was skeptical of the civil rights movement itself. In 1961, of course, the Freedom Rides arrived here in Jackson. And Meredith saw young black activists getting piled into police wagons at the Jackson bus terminal. But he considered their protests futile in the face of these powerful white institutions. He did advocate for resistance to that system, but through his own particular value system. In his mind, the civil rights movement needed to depend on men who were self-reliant, brave, and proud. And he envisioned a special role for himself in this regard. Again, this notion of a divine destiny. Foreshadowing a lot of the language of more modern civil rights activists, he identified what he called a system of, quote, white supremacy. And in his book, he talks about the arbitrary power of the police, the looming threats of racial violence, the limits on black advancement, and how society conditioned black subservience and white privilege, a lot of the language that people use today to describe white supremacy. So to dismantle this system, Meredith conceived what he referred to as his master plan. That plan began with his application to the University of Mississippi. From the winter of 1961 through the fall of 1962, Meredith was engaging in writing applications to the university, enlisting legal help from the NAACP, and wading through the court system in a variety of legal challenges. To do this, he had, in particular, the great support of the NAACP attorney Constance Baker Motley. But it's important to note that Meredith initiated this challenge himself. It's not like the NAACP came to James Meredith. James Meredith started this process and then went to the NAACP once it was underway. It was an endeavor of high stakes and high dangers. Education, of course, could be a vehicle of black advancement. Segregationists recognized that, as well as the African Americans. Thus, it was dangerous. In 1958, an African American man named Clennon King applied to the University of Mississippi to get a graduate degree in history. He was arrested. He was sentenced and basically put into a mental institution. The next year, a military veteran named Clyde Kennard tried to enroll at Mississippi Southern University. He was arrested on a speeding violation and then later framed for stealing $25 of chicken feed. He spent years in jail at Parchment Penitentiary as a result. When Meredith's trial started in June of 1961, he was grilled in his depositions. He was accused of being a tool of the NAACP. Attorneys suggested that he was mentally unbalanced. He lost his case at the U.S. District Court in February of 1962, but it was appealed in June and overturned by the U.S. Appeals Court. This put enormous burdens on James Meredith. At one point, he was arrested on a trumped-up charge of registering to vote in one county while living in another, both in the state of Mississippi. By this time, he'd accumulated enough credits to graduate from Jackson State. He had a young child. He needed to support his family. He thought maybe I should abandon this challenge and apply to Ole Miss Law School at that moment. And he had to be dissuaded by Constance Baker Motley at this point because their case was certainly shaping up as a major test of U.S. constitutional rights. In September of 1962, it would ultimately take 3 attempts to register at the university. At one time, he was in Oxford, he was turned away by the lieutenant governor, Paul Johnson, and then another time in Jackson by Governor Ross Barnett. A third time, as they were arriving in Oxford, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy told his marshals to turn back around, that the threat of violence was too fraught. Again, Ross Barnett was promising order and as a way to try to avoid more federal intervention, but at the same time he was stirring up white resistance, such as when he gave a famous speech at an Ole Miss football game in Jackson a week before the integration. The result of this kind of irresponsible demagoguery by Barnett was the violence on Oxford that we started today's talk with. So Meredith endured the trial of the riot, registered the next morning at the University of Mississippi officially, and from that point on, had to go through this enormous trial of personal discipline. Every morning, as he left Baxter Hall, he was greeted by racial slurs. To quote from 3 Years in Mississippi, "I'd been at the university 10 months before I ever descended the 15 or 20 steps without someone calling me the N-word." He was hung in effigy. He received death threats. At one point, a dead raccoon was plopped upon his car. When troops inspected other dormitories near Baxter Hall, they found rifles, hand grenades, and machetes. At the same time, he was enduring isolation. When he studied in his room, while guarded by U.S. Marshals, students would shoot firecrackers, slam down their books, try to distract him. "I was alone, but never by myself," he reflected. Yet Meredith still had the courage to inject his voice into the national conversation throughout that ordeal of that year at the University of Mississippi. Early in this trial in October of '62, he objected when African American troops who were stationed in Oxford were just being put on garbage duty, and he said basically he said this is an insult to their service and to their uniform. They should be on full service. Then, in between semesters in January of 1963, he threatened to quit the university. Basically in a demand for better conditions. And many people, of course, urged him to stay, give him his larger responsibility. Finally, at a press conference in Jackson right before the spring semester, he gave a statement that seems perhaps odd, but it was also quite telling. In it, he said, quote, "The Negro should not return to the University of Mississippi. The prospects for him are too unpromising. However, I have decided that I, J.H. Meredith, will register for the second semester at the University of Mississippi." In this somewhat strange way, he was underlining his independence, right? The Negro shouldn't go there, but I will. Doing it on his own terms, in other words. Of course, James Meredith was no ordinary student. He was a 30-year-old Air Force veteran, and of course, the only black man at this institution, heavily guarded by U.S. troops and U.S. marshals. He was a figure of international significance. He was a bullseye for racist violence, under constant protection. Once when he played the campus golf course with the history professor James Silver, there was a military helicopter that had to hover overhead, and soldiers were surrounding the course. While he was in school that year, he appeared on Meet the Press. He befriended celebrities such as Dick Gregory, Sammy Davis Jr. He conferred with James Baldwin, who came to contribute to a photo essay for Look magazine. By the time that James Meredith graduated in August of 1963, after the summer semester, he was a critical figure in American history. Yet he also had to leave Mississippi immediately for his own protection. In his version of the story, those 3 years in Mississippi were the first stage in this divinely ordained plan. He still planned to destroy white supremacy, still sought to rise as a special leader. But in the aftermath of the Ole Miss crisis, Meredith kind of struggled to find his life's work. He's too much of an individualist to really work in any sort of established organization, and perhaps a little too inconsistent to forge something on his own. He moved to Washington, D.C. He opened something called the James Meredith Educational Fund that provided grants for at-risk high school students who had the potential to go to college, but it didn't pan out, and he left it. He moved to Nigeria for a 3-year fellowship at the University of Ibadan, but he left after 1 year, complaining about poor communication and disorganization. He moved to New York City to attend law school at Columbia University, and here he envisioned a political career. But at the same time, he didn't feel connected to the civil rights movement. When he gave speeches, he would criticize nonviolent demonstrations on the idea that Americans respect force, not nonviolence. He said, quote, "Nonviolence is making cowards of our men." By 1966, you could say his public profile was dwindling. The New York Times refused to publish a letter that he wrote to the editor. He tried to get on the Today Show, but couldn't get booked. He wrote an article for Saturday Evening Post that was rejected. A headline in the New York Amsterdam News, an African-American newspaper, said, "Whatever happened to James Meredith?" And then, in June of 1966, on June 6th in particular, the second day of a walk from Memphis to Jackson that Meredith was undertaking. And he undertook it for 2 reasons. One, he said, was to encourage African-Americans to register to vote. This is a year after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Mississippi is just starting to see its first uptick in black voter registration as a result. And the second thing that he wanted was to conquer what he saw as that all-pervasive fear that African-Americans faced in Mississippi, that culture of intimidation and violence. And if James Meredith, the most hated black man in Mississippi to many whites, could walk through the state doing this, then it would buoy up the rest of black Mississippians. He also perhaps had a third unstated goal, which was this would help to launch his political career when he graduated from law school to go back to Mississippi. This march began as more or less the endeavor of a solitary man. He had a few companions, but he said you had to be an independent man and you had to arrange your own transportation. It wasn't in the vein of a civil rights mass march. And then on that second day of that march, June 6th, he was just south of Hernando, Mississippi, passing down a gently dipping stretch of road when he heard a shout from the side, "James Meredith, James Meredith." There was a white man in a gully who raised his shotgun and shot 3 times. He critically wounded James Meredith with birdshot. It was lodged into his head, his neck, his back, his leg. He survived the attack, and it became, as you might imagine, enormous news, right? This picture was basically on the front page of every newspaper in America the next day. There was a civil rights bill before Congress at the time, the Civil Rights Bill of '66, and liberal politicians of both parties said that it should pass based on James Meredith's sacrifice. One paper called it, quote, "a bargain in blood." But James Meredith continued to project a voice based on his own independence and manhood. In fact, when he was interviewed by Carl Fleming, the Newsweek journalist, he said he regretted that he didn't have a gun with him on the walk. He said, he shot me like I was a goddamn rabbit, and he regretted that. The march continued in his name. What began as one man's walk became the Meredith March Against Fear. It was taken up by the major civil rights organizations, and over 3 weeks, it brought together figures such as Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael and hundreds of activists. They registered black voters, they conquered old fears. This march is perhaps most famous for Stokely Carmichael unveiling the cry of Black Power, which came to define that next stage in the black freedom struggle. And Meredith healed enough from his wounds to return to Mississippi at the end, when there was the final rally at the state capitol in Jackson. It was James Meredith who won the largest cheers. It restored his public voice. Now the Saturday Evening Post printed his article, this time about the march and about his larger ideology. It was called My Mississippi is Everywhere. It outlined his experiences on the march, but also his larger message about needing to conquer white supremacy. And so in '66, Meredith was restored to prominence once again. He once again had been able to summon, through his individual will, the power of mass institutions to pay attention, to inject himself into the larger national conversation. And yet, in the aftermath of that, in some ways, that power dissipated. He had political problems, for one. In March of 1967, back in New York City, he made the decision that he was going to run against Adam Clayton Powell for his seat in Congress. And Adam Clayton Powell was a 12-term congressman based in Harlem, a Democrat, and Powell was beloved by his constituency. Meredith was so criticized for it that he ended up dropping out of the race. He also made some curious decisions. He endorsed his former foe, Ross Barnett, when Barnett ran for governor again in 1967. He supported Richard Nixon for president in 1968, when most African Americans had tilted by then almost fully to the Democratic Party. In the 1970s, back in Mississippi, he ran for office sometimes as a Democrat, sometimes as a Republican, sometimes as an independent. It was never successful. He also endured business failings. He had investments in a construction company and a jewelry store that didn't pan out. He bought an apartment building in the Bronx, but he spent 2 days in jail after accusations that he had harassed his tenants. Back in Jackson in the 1970s, he sold Amway products, opened a small nightclub, declared bankruptcy, started his own church called the Reunification Church Under God, which didn't really pan out. And that sort of tied into the third issue. It was sort of increasingly people were identifying James Meredith in news stories by the 1980s, if it came up at all, it was for sort of quirky behavior. He was arrested after a dispute at a Pizza Hut. The University of Cincinnati hired him to teach a 3-semester sequence course, but he left midway through the first semester. And then in the late 80s and early 90s, he very controversially aligned himself with figures in far-right politics. He worked for a time in Washington, D.C. for the North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms. He even endorsed, in the Louisiana governor race, the state senator David Duke, a former leader in the Ku Klux Klan. Yet, by the 1990s, Meredith moved back to Mississippi and settled into his life's final act. As many of you know, he's been a familiar figure around Jackson now for decades. A man going about a relatively ordinary existence in some ways, but at the same time, this living, breathing chunk of history. Historians in general have tended to avoid wrestling with the meaning of James Meredith. With some exceptions, most of the books you read on the Ole Miss crisis portray him as he was portrayed in '62, as just this upright hero. Yet he's clearly a figure of enormous historical significance. As one example of that, the enormous James H. Meredith collection at the University of Mississippi, which archives his correspondence, his records, his writings, and his other documents. Just outside that library is the Civil Rights Monument at Ole Miss, which includes a statue of James Meredith. But that statue doesn't particularly convey Meredith's meaning in any significant way. In fact, the statue was only added after there were protests from black students. If you've ever seen this monument, you know that it has sort of these vague platitudes toward courage and perseverance and opportunity and knowledge. And it cherry picks quotes from Meredith's memoir, 3 Years in Mississippi, that show him loving Mississippi. But it omits passages about his sadness and his rage at black people's second-class citizenship. That monument was dedicated in 2006. There were tributes from Representative John Lewis, the actor Morgan Freeman, the former governor William Winter, but Meredith himself was not invited to speak. At various times, James Meredith has said that he wanted that statue destroyed. that it ignores the violence and the fear that have shaped white power, that it associates him with the civil rights movement when he was in fact more of a critic of it. And yet that statue is also a reminder of his iron will, right? Despite the violent and legal forces of racism on that very campus. This was evidenced in 2014, as many of you know, when 2 Ole Miss students left a Confederate battle flag there and draped a noose around the statue's neck. So James Meredith and that statue remain symbols of black resistance to white supremacy. To this day, Meredith insists upon his individuality. He still combines conservative social values with this radical desire to remake American society. In the summer of 2020, after his shocking murder by a policeman, James Meredith, too, proclaimed, quote, "I am George Floyd," in an article in CNN. In that summer of protests, he aligned himself with the Black Lives Matter movement. Quote, "I am filled with both joy and hope," he said. "White supremacy may be the most evil beast that's ever stalked the halls of history, and today it may finally be mortally wounded." James Meredith might not be what you want him to be or what I want him to be. He's not a liberal icon in the mold of a John Lewis. He's not a traditional conservative, nor is he a populist one in the vein of a Donald Trump. But he isn't someone that we can just dismiss. We owe it to him to consider him on his individual terms. We owe it to the larger study of the African American experience. We owe it to the study of the state of Mississippi and its history. The struggle for black freedom can travel along different paths. Sometimes they intersect. And in his own way, James Meredith has forged his own path. He's never given up that fight. If you want, you can say James Meredith is still a man on a mission. Thank you.
I think we have time for some questions. If you'll raise your hand, I'll bring the mic to you.
Great talk, by the way. I guess my question revolves around like history and accessibility. I think it's a really cool idea to merge something as impactful as James Meredith's legacy and what happened in sort of a comic strip. But I also know as a writer myself, merging those two are complicated, especially the more like uglier parts people don't want to talk about. So what was that process like of like planning this out and sort of merging those two parts, and what were some of the challenges, to be honest?
That's a very interesting question, and one that we grappled with quite a bit. I'd say there are 2 things to think about there. One is in terms of audience, right? Because we wanted this to be a book that was accessible in particular to younger audiences. Anything from late elementary school, and particularly middle school and early high school, I think would find this book accessible. But also just a general history that would hit anyone. You know, a lot of people aren't big readers, but they still want to learn history, and we hope the book would give a lens into that. So questions of language came up, for instance, right? James Meredith was constantly called the N-word on the campus of Ole Miss. So how do we convey that, and how do we convey the nastiness that he faced? Well, at the same time, that's a term that has become one that we don't even say out loud anymore, right? So our choice with that ultimately was N *******R, right? So that students would know what we were talking about, but at the same time we weren't using that very poisonous term and not trying to cause students harm in that way. Even with the term Negro, because the story is told in Man on a Mission in James Meredith's voice. It's as if he's narrating it. And so we relied really heavily on 3 Years in Mississippi, the memoir that he wrote in the 1960s. That's the primary vehicle for telling that story. And in that, it was 1966, so he used the term Negro, right? But we had to wrestle with, students would still find Negro sort of strange and off-putting if it was constantly throughout the book. So our choice with that ultimately was that when it was a text box, which is as if James Meredith is talking but narrating the story, we changed it to black. But when it was dialogue, we continued to use Negro to keep it sort of authentic to that moment. So that was one of the big challenges, was in terms of language. You're talking about being a writer and then how do you put this in a visual form. For me, that was a huge challenge too. I wasn't a graphic novel reader. It wasn't something that I'd always aspired to do. I wrote books through, I used words, in other words, right? The challenge of letting the image do the story, or letting the image drive the story in some ways, was the hardest adjustment for me as the writer. That that was my biggest struggle, was finding ways to let the story be propelled as much as possible by image and to use as few words as possible in that sense. And I think I got a little bit better at it over time. And part of that was adjusting to what Bill Murray, our illustrator, what his strengths were. And it turned out that he was really excellent. If I could give him sort of photographs from the time that conveyed what we were trying to do, he would use that photograph almost like a departure point for his art. As you can see, a lot of them are very modified photographs that have all these sort of visual flourishes to them. That's Bill's style. And that he was really good at sort of working within that sort of traditional frame. And once I figured that out, it took the first few chapters in the early struggles. Then I think our book got more, it had a voice and it had a style that was its own. But that was the biggest challenge that I faced. Any other questions?
Hello. First, when I was looking at James Meredith over there, I thought he was Dick Gregory's twin. But my question to Mr. Meredith is, I was wondering, during the era of 1962, did you ever receive an apology from the school, the students, or law enforcement?
The question was for you. Did you ever receive an apology from the university or from law enforcement or from anybody? Chris is going to bring you the microphone.
No.
In putting the book together and considering your audience and age sets, can you just speak to that? Because, at this point in time, we have birth to death and a larger kind of spectrum of, you're speaking to. Who is it, age appropriate for, and, how do we bring this into the public and educating ourselves?
When I was in grad school, my advisor always gave me the advice of have a reader in your head, and don't let it be me. Don't let it be your graduate advisor, and have it be the kind of person who you think would be the typical reader for your book, right? And so think about an actual person in that way. And of course, for other books, I had adults in my head. So for this one, I had to think about a 14-year-old kid, essentially. That's who was the reader in my head. Is this going to make sense to them? Is this going to be? Have we given them enough background that they would understand the civil rights struggle? Are we not? I talked a lot in this talk about understanding the complexities of James Meredith, and we tried to really convey that in the book to get a sense of that individuality. But you're not going to see by the same token him. His struggles in New York City with harassing tenants or something like that. The publisher even said, we had the association with Jesse Helms more in the forefront in the original draft. There's still an image of Jesse Helms along with James Meredith in there, but we didn't use his name in the final draft. So we're trying to just keep it as, if we hit that 14-year-old, we can then get younger audiences. My fourth grader read it, and he said it was good. But adults could, I think, it's still written in James Meredith's voice, and I think it's, I hope anyway, that it's appealing to adults as well.
We have a question from the live stream that I think goes well with that. How will this historical graphic novel get in the hands of readers? Is it available online, Kindle?
There's no digital version of the book. It's a paper copy book, but it's available at any major bookseller. And the University of Arkansas Press website generally has the best deals, so we encourage that. But it's on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, you name it. It's if you just Google "Man on a Mission" James Meredith, the book will pop up.
Yeah, I guess before the program started, there were about 24 teachers or education students from Mississippi College who came through, and I think most of them bought copies and had Mr. Meredith sign them. Other questions?
Did they ever catch, identify, apprehend, or prosecute the coward that tried to shoot, that shot him?
In June of 1966? Yes, it's a very interesting story in its own right, and I wrote a lot about it in Down on the Crossroads. It's a man named Aubrey Norval, who was a white man from Bartlett, just outside of Memphis. And at first, when he shot Meredith, quickly he was apprehended by the police, and he didn't offer much. He didn't seem to have a real exit plan. It was very sort of curious circumstances. And people assumed that he was just, your kind of run-of-the-mill Klansman type or a but he had no affiliation with any white supremacist organization. And he kept kind of quiet about his motivations. He's never revealed them. He passed away, but he was still alive when I was writing that book. And I tried to interview him just like a gazillion other people had tried before. And everyone he just shut down. He never explained his motives. He spent 4 years in jail. He was in Parchman. He was sentenced to 4 or 5 years in jail, but only spent 1.5 years in jail. But still never revealed his motives. Now, the really interesting part of that was because he refused to discuss it, he became sort of a vehicle for conspiracy theories from both civil rights activists, but also from the right. So, amongst many civil rights activists, say, oh, this guy, he was in on it with the Mississippi Highway Patrol, and even the FBI, they knew he was going to shoot him. What you might expect. But those especially in Mississippi, a number of whites, including the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, which was this state-funded institution that was trying to uphold segregation, had investigators who were trying to prove that Norval, the guy who shot him, was paid by civil rights activists. And their evidence was that he just wounded him with birdshot. Once he did that, it would become this big to-do, and we'd march through Mississippi, and we would change the whole, we would once again bring federal tyranny upon the state of Mississippi. Which has no basis in fact whatsoever. So his silence, Norval's silence, is kind of an interesting vehicle into different racial attitudes in that moment.
Other questions? I have a question. In looking back at 3 years in Mississippi, a lot of the language that's used, a lot of Mr. Meredith's concepts really do seem to resonate with the modern, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement. Is there do you see that at all? Is that?
Absolutely. When I'd used, of course, 3 years in Mississippi when I was writing this book Down on the Crossroads, but then when the University Press of Mississippi reissued the memoir, I think it was published in 2017, I wrote the introduction for it. And so it brought me back and remember, this is in the midst of Trayvon Martin and a number of these other high-profile instances. And to read James Meredith's descriptions from the 1960s of his life in Kosciuszko, of sort of the arbitrary power of police, of the ways in which just everyday patterns of racial interaction are designed to enforce white privilege and enforce black inferiority, an unequal justice system. And even using that phrase, white supremacy, right? That's a language that came back in the 2010s in some ways. So it absolutely connects in a direct line, I think.
I just want to say two things. Number one, I've written 30 books. I've read more than 100 written by other people. But I believe that the book that has been reviewed today by Mr. Aram Goudsouzian is the most important book ever been published with my name in it. And I guess I'm recommending that everybody that haven't got a copy yet need to get one. But more importantly, my real mission from God is yet to be done. Prevention is better than cure. To see and not to pay attention kills the elders. To be told and not to pay attention is the problem of the youth. My last mission from God is to start a process of the uplift of my character by Mississippians. That's the solution to our problem. Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, we have copies of Man on a Mission over here, along with some other books. I think Down to the Crossroads is already sold out of our table. Yeah. Thank you all for being here. I hope that we see you tomorrow at the Welty House, Ron Rash, next Wednesday for the Delta State Sit-In documentary here. Help me thank today Vijay Shah, Aram Goudsouzian, and James Meredith for this program.